Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Sue and I will be presenting on the privacy program, managing the data privacy landscape. Before we get started, just some brief introductions. I am Managing Director in Focal Point's National Risk Consulting Practice. Primarily, I focus on IT audit as well as information security type of reviews. I have done quite a few GLBA reviews, and I've done a lot of data privacy and information security audits. So I come from the audit side of the house, and I think Sue can provide more details on data privacy.
Thank you, Raj. Hi, my name is Sue Yim. I'm a senior manager in the data privacy practice at Focal Point. My experience involves doing various types of audits, but in addition, also doing assessments for some of my clients in regards to CCPA, GDPR, and privacy maturity, and in addition to helping them with some of the remediation programs such as consumer rights, CCPA, and PIA, and third-party risk management. In the next slide, Roger will actually talk to you about the agenda that we have for you today.
Perfect. Before we get started, just wanted to let everybody know that our contact information is at the end of the slide deck. So if any of the information is interesting or if you'd like to know more, feel free to reach out to us. We'll also be discussing a little bit about the NIST Cybersecurity Privacy Framework. And if you're interested in getting your hands on that, you can also reach out to us. So for today's agenda, we're going to go through very briefly some of the latest and greatest in terms of CCPA and some of the data privacy legislation. I think considering majority of you probably have a basic understanding, I think Sue's probably just going to give you a brief update. Most of the time, we're going to focus on understanding how to build a data privacy audit program, kind of focus more towards IT auditors, and I'll give you my take on it as well, because when I started doing data privacy audits, it was not something that was very readily available. The data from ISACA or other IAPP, otherwise, there wasn't a lot of regulatory kind of audit programs out there. So wanted to give you my take on how I went about building it and kind of give you some tips to go along with that. So we'll go through that process of building the data privacy program, and we'll talk about internal audit's role and basically how you can be successful in building out the program.
Thank you, Raj. So as you all know, due to COVID, the world grinded to a halt, and this did have impacted privacy. As you will note that some regulations are being postponed with more emphasis on public health surveillance, where some regulations will still be enforced due to security and privacy incidents that are appearing in the news. And as most employees start working remotely, the technology use has actually skyrocketed. What we saw in March 2020 alone, there were 67 incidents worldwide. So the increase in technology and the way that technology has kind of evolved is becoming more and more important that companies start understanding their data and classifying their data as a priority. We also saw in recent news that the invalidation of Privacy Shield in July, and AB 1281 was signed by the governor in September, and then CCPA is pending election results. So what does this all mean? So in the next slide, I will go over the privacy landscape and let you know why it's important for companies to make privacy a key focus area. Okay, and so here's what the privacy landscape looks like. As you can see, the U.S. alone, new regulations are cropping up every so often. We're seeing it more times in the news. And a lot of what we notice is a lot of states are actually observing what CCPA enforcement looks like and updating their existing privacy regulations. There's also have been talks about federal regulations to ensure consistency. And this is going to be very similar to other countries too, and such as like Brazil and Thailand. And so it's going to be very important to make sure that you have a privacy program. Next slide. So as you can imagine, it's going to become more important that companies be proactive rather than reactive to any new regulations that gets enforced. What we have seen is that companies have been reactive, that most companies have been reactive to CCPA and GDPR, and it's costing a lot of money. So now, with the ever-growing implementation and regulations on privacy, companies that are reacting have to change their operations each time. So, and like I mentioned previously, CCPA is influenced many other states. So in the next slide, I'll talk about some quick facts about CCPA. We're all very familiar with CCPA, and so I'll just give a quick overview. CCPA became effective on January 1st, 2020. However, although there is a caveat, however, that even though it's been effective on January 1st, 2020, it is expected that companies are able to action on consumer rights requests when they come in on January 1st, 2020. So what that means is you actually have to have the data to prove to the consumer from January 1st, 2019. And so regulators are actually, and then CCPA enforcement actually was implemented, will be enforced by regulators by July 1st, 2020, as you all know. And so they will do that look back to see if you've been compliant. So why is CCPA important to U.S. companies that probably do not do business in California? Like I mentioned, CCPA is mostly focused on California residents, but more regulations are going to be enforced, and more regulations are looking at CCPA. And a lot of times consumers are holding, and this includes U.S. and international consumers, are holding companies more accountable for their data. And it's going to be more expensive to actually update your company operations, reacting to every new privacy enforcement. In the next slide, I'll kind of go into why is the privacy important now. So like I mentioned, the reason why the privacy program is important now is consumers are becoming more aware that they see headlines related to breaches or have their own personal data compromised. And in addition, new privacy regulations are being passed more frequently. To put it in perspective, in 1995, just 1% of the world had internet access. Today, that number has skyrocketed to 4 billion internet users worldwide. So privacy is no longer a concern just for like certain industries like payment card, healthcare, and financial services industries.
Thank you, Sue. So I think based on what Sue has provided, the information she's given, I think it's very clear that data privacy is becoming a larger and larger part of the risk assessment process for the company, and is kind of moving up the value chain, if you will. How do we then manage this privacy program? Where do we start? A couple of different areas for you to consider. I've put on the screen here 9 different areas. I put 9 areas here because typically when we look at data privacy, we automatically default to looking at information security and looking at data privacy within that information security program. That's typically where a lot of people start, and that's where I started as well. What I've come to realize is that data privacy is really across the organization. And if you don't look at these other 7 areas, like human resources, marketing, legal, procurement, customer service, you're going to be leaving out a good chunk of your risk. Obviously, if the risk assessment is done properly, then the rest of your audit program isn't really going to matter much. So very critical that we look across the organization and we find risk. For example, in marketing, they might be creating a marketing program where they're collecting information that will be critical for CCPA, either as a data processor or a collector. So it's important that we consider outside of security, outside of privacy, how it's impacting our program. Third-party risk. This is an area that we talk about considerably in the forthcoming slides, but just briefly, if you are not an auditor and you are on the business side, when you are doing business with a third party, the first thing that comes to your mind is not data privacy. So you're not going to think about what data is being sent outside and what risk you're basically creating for the company. So it's important that you kind of spearhead this process to educate the business. Otherwise, it's going to kind of spiral out of control. So looking at it from a 3 lines of defense standpoint, when we look at compliance assessments versus audits, really you're kind of partnering with the enterprise to meet this objective. First, second line of defense, IT, compliance, they're probably going to select which framework they want to use. more often than not, they'll probably end up using the NIST cybersecurity framework because their privacy framework is pretty strong and is pretty widely used. But if you're on the banking side, it might be based on the FFIEC, or otherwise it might be GLBA, depending on the type of bank you're working with. So depending on the industry and the different type of regulatory requirements, the framework can slightly change. So I think while auditors, we have to maintain our independence, we can provide some insight as well in terms of which frameworks might be utilized because we understand the regulatory environment fairly well. Also, working with the compliance folks, I think it's important that policies and procedures that they put in place, are comprehensive, cover those regulatory areas, and then really we're working with the compliance team to make sure that we help fill those gaps so that policies procedures can be updated accordingly. So the importance of the data privacy audit, kind of what I alluded to earlier, what we can do to add value. Certainly doing the independent assessment, that's probably the number one goal of doing a data privacy audit. But in addition to that, we can really add a lot of value by filling gaps, identifying gaps that regulators might later fine the company for. So, for example, we talk about building out the program, we talk about doing the risk assessment, and if we don't know where the data is, we're really not going to be able to do a data privacy, any kind of mitigation for the risk. The data classification program really is not a regulatory requirement, but that is a basis for meeting a lot of these control objectives. So that's an example where internal audit can provide meaningful recommendations, that can help curtail regulatory issues down the line. We'll talk about others as well. And then who performs these audits. So internal audit is being an independent assessor. Compliance might be doing their own audits. The thing to keep in mind here is that along with the inside and the outside regulatory bodies, you even have the Attorney General getting involved. You have independent or class action lawsuits. So there's a pretty heavy burden on getting this right. So I would say because of that reason alone, a lot of the data privacy issues are going to rise to the top, and we'll give you some tips on how to make sure they get remediated before they become larger issues. So moving on to the key areas of focus. These are some of the areas of focus that you probably want to build out in your data privacy program. There are quite a few of them here, and I'm just going to focus on a couple of them. The first one really talks about data minimization, and that has to do with the fact that if you are able to build out a robust data privacy program, you know where your data is, you can then work to minimize your risk exposure by not maintaining multiple copies of the same data, only keeping data that you really need, etc., etc. So these different areas, they're all important, but because of this, because we have limited time here, I'm really just going to focus on a couple of them. The first one is going to be number 5, which is the DPIA. So the DPIA is similar to your risk assessment. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't do the risk assessment properly, you're really not going to be able to build out a program to mitigate your risk, and your audit procedures are either going to be only 80% complete, or you're not going to be able to mitigate the risk for the regulator. So the DPIA is going to be super critical, and I know that Sue has done hundreds of these, and I've done a few myself. So if you need any help doing those, then we can help you as well. On the on the regulatory side, the breach notification is pretty key because this is pretty cut and dry. You have X number of days to report a breach, and if you don't do it by then, they'll come and fine you. So you have to have pretty strong controls in order to be in compliance with some of these legal requirements. So the breach notification process, that whole area is pretty black and white and should be pretty buttoned down. The third I'll select here is the third-party risk management. And for the reasons I mentioned earlier, a lot of the business side folks aren't really thinking about, if I send my data to a SaaS provider, then is it secure? And they're not really thinking about it from that standpoint, nor are they thinking about it from a data minimization or control procedures. They're really just thinking about the business, which makes sense. So what we have to do is make sure we educate them that by sending the data to a third party, they're not transferring the risk. We still own the risk. So we have to be able to mitigate that. Either that's through our contractual obligations. I think a lot of IT auditors are used to reviewing SOC reports. So of course those will be key as well, making sure that we have complementary user entity controls. And so there are different legal statutes there as well. So we have to make sure we cover those. So probably working with legal on that, making sure we have the right to audit, etc. But this is a key area that you want to consider. I think the rest of these, you'll feel free to read through those. And then if you have any questions, you can always email us. So in building up the program, there's a couple of things to take into consideration. The first is just kind of how the sections within the CCPA are laid out. So you have different topics in different sections. And what we tried to do in our creation of the audit program is we tied the procedures to the different sections within CCPA. And then we created control objectives and topics that coincide with those sections. So this approach is consistent with the NIST framework. It's more specific because we actually map the control objectives back to the sections of the CCPA. So it fits very well with the regulatory requirement. But this is also in coordination with what the NIST cybersecurity framework has. So I think there is a good synergy there between what the CCPA requires and then what the cybersecurity framework, for example, from NIST requires. So this is the approach that we have taken. So if you would like to take a similar approach, we can help you with that as well. Next, I think there's two types of audits that Sue conducts. So I think she wants to give you some more insights on those.
Thank you, Raj. So there are two types of audits that can be performed. One is called the full audit, which is kind of like your entry-level controls audit. And this is usually performed right after a privacy assessment. And this helps to ensure that the company is actually monitoring and remediating the gaps identified in their initial assessment. The privacy landscape should be monitored because it will be important to understand how the company is keeping track of organizational and technological changes and how they're progressing on the remediation efforts from the initial assessment. The micro audit is more like your focus audit. It's more of your operations audit. And so you want to make sure that there is actually a process in place and in addition, there is no value in actually testing those areas if they're not ready to be tested. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that's going to be very important is that documentation does not always equal what's actually happening in operations. And as internal auditors, we do know that. And so it'll be important to validate what the operational effectiveness of those key areas are. So in the next slide, I would kind of discuss the key areas of focus that you might want to consider for a micro audit. The reason why we selected these 6 areas is because how they interact directly with consumers or how they're specific to both for the regulations. The data subject rights, DSR, it directly interacts with consumers and it is a requirement. And also please note that if your company does not have a strong DSR program, this is where complaints from consumers actually gets escalated to regulators. Again, PIA, DPIA, like Rajan mentioned, it's important to understand how the company is changing and how it impacts privacy. The information in the privacy is outdated if a DPIA and PIA is not performed. And we all know that technology continues to change. Retention is another one, which is CCPA actually that specifically states that the minimal use of data. And what we have seen often is data is often kept longer than necessarily and sometimes even indefinitely. So this exposes companies to more risk as they're actually keeping data that's outdated, not valuable, and it could be possibly exposed to incidents. And it costs a lot to store. And in addition, it makes it more tedious for DSR requests. The consent is also very important, and it is a requirement. And this actually drives, if you don't have a good consent management program, this is going to drive your DSR complaints. And like I mentioned, DSR complaints go to regulators, to be escalated to regulators. So you need to have a good consent program. And breach response, this is a requirement, but it's also important to understand how the company identifies and actions on incidents. Without a good incident management response plan, this actually exposes companies to more bigger breaches, and in addition, significant fines. And then, as we previously mentioned, third parties is one of the areas that drives both regulations. If you're engaging with a third party and your company did not do their own due diligence on vetting them out, this is going to drive a significant amount of fines. And what we have seen is that the regulators are actually placing the company liable for things that might go wrong at third parties. And so it's going to be very important. Next slide, I'll talk to you about an actual scenario that I've experienced in regards to a micro audit. So we worked with a Fortune 500 company in the food industry who had policies and procedures in place, documentation. And they actually got contacted by regulators because they actually got a consumer complaint from the EU. And if you look in the outside, everything looks perfect. They have policy, public privacy notices on their website that matches up with the GDPR. But what the regulators actually said was their website was too complex. They contacted Full Point, and we reviewed all their websites. And what we identified was there was just too many ways that the consumer can contact the organization about any type of question. And it wasn't exactly clear where that the consumer can go for specific questions. In addition, we found an outdated email address or phone number. And so based on these observations, the company updated their website, consolidated into one form, and they actually did not get fined by regulators. So we expect this similar type of enforcement for CCPA. So next slide, we'll talk to you about internal audit's role.
Great, thanks, Sue. I think the case study is very helpful in driving home the points. So in terms of internal audit's role, there are some key roles that we play and how we can really help. We talked about the master data management, and when internal audit does any kind of risk assessment, they oftentimes work with IT to get a topology diagram, or they gather data in terms of what systems and applications are in scope for SOX. So internal audit actually has a pretty good insight into what data and systems might be housing private information, consumer information, things that might expose us to CCPA regulations. So I think by sharing that information, really internal audit can play a key role. Because for example, if you're doing a risk assessment for SOX and a new SaaS provider is now in scope, that's probably going to be in scope as well for data privacy because of the financial information and the PII, et cetera, that goes along with it. So that's a key area of focus. Second is just the identification. We mentioned about the systems, and then you're mapping that back to CCPA, GDPR, helping them to do that, probably utilizing either the internal audit framework or the SOX framework. The gap assessment we talked about a little bit earlier, really to help management fill those gaps. I think some of the key areas of focus, as I mentioned earlier, is that you may not have a regulatory requirement, for example, to create a data classification program, but without filling those types of gaps, you aren't really going to be able to create an effective program, as well as avoid any regulatory fines. So when you create your issue, you probably want to include those sections that we kind of noted earlier in the CCPA, and that will help to escalate the issue as well for remediation purposes, kind of what you would do with the root cause. And then in terms of frequency and looking at the scope of the audits, if you are doing something that's first or second time in the year, you're probably going to probably have to repeat it in order to improve it. So if you are in the maturity end of that scale, you could probably do the audit once. But if you're still developing the program, you probably want to do the data privacy audit at least twice a year. In terms of focusing on key privacy risks, and we talked about the area of vendor management, making sure that you manage those information that is transferred out of the organization either via regulatory legal contracts, or making sure you review SOC reports, or you have some other vendor management type of program. Again, the business is not going to focus on that, so it becomes internal audit's role to kind of spearhead that effort. Number 6 is the evaluation of the security controls. I saved the best for last because I think this is an area where internal audit can add a lot of value. For example, if you look at PRAC-P1, which is the Identity Management, Authentication, and Access Control, this is the actual section of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Now, they talk about the authorization of credentials, physical access, remote access, and a lot of these access permissions are going to be almost one for one what you would test in terms of GITCs or SOCs. And so a lot of the work that you're doing for those audit programs is going to carry over for data privacy. I had the opportunity to do this approach for a bank, and we tested the controls independently for cybersecurity and data privacy, and then we tested them the following year in coordination with SOX and IT general controls, and we basically saved the company about 40% in terms of the total number of hours. That's a huge savings for the company. So again, this is a great opportunity for internal audit to show their value and really help mitigate risk at the same time. In terms of reporting to the executive and the board, so I think the general premise is that most people understand the cost of cybersecurity and data security breaches are going up. So I think people, executives, I know, kind of have it on their mind that they don't want to be the next victim. So really, when we report up to the executive and the board, I think we should take a two-prong approach. One is that we should notate the issues and cite the regulatory requirements and then help push it up. But at the same time, we should help mitigate those risks as well, and kind of provide almost like an advisory type of solution where we can, say that talking to information security, IT, compliance, this is what we intend to do. And really, that's there to drive home the point that internal audit is obviously not an adversary, but there shouldn't be perceived as an adversary. They should be perceived as part of the solution. So I think that really will drive home that point that we are elevating the risk, we're citing their legal requirements, and at the same time, we're providing a thoughtful solution to kind of mitigate the issue. And I think management will, appreciate that, and also I think will help to drive the company's growth as well. You look at some of the recent breaches, like for example, you had the breach at Garmin, which literally brought their whole business to a halt. Those types of breaches are, a subcomponent of data privacy. Really, if they can't protect their cybersecurity, they're not going to be able to protect the data privacy component either. Kind of go hand in hand. So I think when we kind of implement a data privacy audit, you're also helping to mitigate some of those cybersecurity risks, and that's really going to help becoming an enabler for the business to help them to expand, to gain more customers, etc. So I think those are the types of messaging that we should be using to the board, and they're really receptive to that kind of language.
Thank you, Raj. So you might ask yourself, if you're a service provider or if you have relations with a service provider, why is an audit program needed? They don't directly access personal data. Like I mentioned, companies are being held accountable for breaches identified with third parties where they share data. So more companies are doing their due diligence on third parties they engage. In addition, as companies are held more accountable by consumers, they want to engage with third parties that support them regarding DSR requests, having security safeguards in place, and platforms that actually have considerations in regards to privacy. Many of the companies that I work with are actually making sure that the third parties they engage with have a privacy program. And I've seen that my clients have actually terminated relationships due to not helping them with a privacy program. So in the next slide, in summary, it is very important to maintain a continuous monitoring of privacy programs Technology is changing rapidly, and it is very important that we validate the privacy program. In addition, internal audit can provide significant value by reporting risk executives and board on privacy concerns. To help your teams gain more knowledge, it'll be important to be a member of the IAPP, maybe get a certification, and also referring to regulatory resources. We hope that this information was very helpful. Next slide. This is our contact information, and if you do have any question in regards to any privacy-related questions, we just feel free to contact us. We often get questions on how to implement a privacy program, what to look for, how to interpret the regulation, and how to overall implement the structure of maturing the privacy landscape. Next slide. This is our practice, some of our offerings that we have, integrated practice. Similar to like data lifecycle of personal data, it's important to also consider the life cycle of maturing your privacy program. And privacy requires an integrated approach to maturing the privacy landscape, which involves collaborations between privacy, legal, compliance, and various other departments. So our firm has also an integrated approach to help companies take the integrated approach with their privacy needs. And in the next slide. This is the finale of our presentation. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that you found this information very important, very valuable.
Don't forget to reach out to us if you would like the NIST cybersecurity privacy program. We'll be happy to send it to you. Thank you.